Good afternoon. This is Hope Rosky with Business, Arts, and Events, and today's focus is on business. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Andrew Fiala to our show today. Welcome, Dr. Fiala.
Hi, glad to be with you.
Oh, I'm so glad you're here. Dr. Fiala, you have quite the background. I'm so highly impressed. Not only are you a guest writer for the Fresno Bee, which is the local Valley newspaper here, but you also are a professor and the head of the ethics department at California State University, Fresno.
Yeah.
Correct? Yes. All right. Well, one of the big things and one of the main topics that has really been in the forefront today when we talk about where our country is how we treat one another. And that comes down to our civility, our manners, how we grew up, what we were raised with in our value system. And, many times, as a doctor or Alexandra Hudson would say, we can't let our egos get in the way of, really the bigger picture of the outcome. How do we as a society kind of just step back a little bit and not let our egos get in the way?
If only I knew the answer to that
Oh,
one,
I know
Hope.
you have some good advice on this one, though.
Yeah, well, this is a perennial problem. So, my work, I'm a philosopher. I view things from a 3,000-year perspective, and the Greeks recognize this problem. It's certainly an issue in Christianity. Buddhism talks about surrendering the ego. All the world's traditions teach that it's better to think about the other than the self. But of course, that's difficult because of it's just sort of natural for us to be selfish. That's the tension in human life, frankly, right? So you use that word civility. One of the things that civilization does is it teaches us how to think beyond ourselves. So almost anything you could think about in any civilization that involves ethics, manners, politeness, business, all of this stuff involves looking beyond your own narrow self-interest and taking into account the interests of others. We have to learn how to restrain our most basic impulses, and how to think of ourselves as members of a community rather than as a selfish ego pursuing its own self-interest. And if you think about like how we raise kids, that's what we teach them to do, and we teach them to say please and thank you, and that's the process. Some scholars call this the civilizing process. No one's born knowing these things,
Right.
but civilizations that function and that work find some way to teach the next generation again and again how to overcome their egos.
And
It's
that's
imperfect,
right.
and we always work at it. So, but it's very, very important.
Well, I go back to Psych 101 and Sigmund Freud, the id, the ego, and the superego, and the id wants what it wants when it wants it. And that's where we have to be able to step back a bit and say, well, that's true, but we have to kind of look at that bigger picture. And when we talk about manners, and I'm glad you're addressing this, when I visited the South, it is no matter where I went, what I did, it was please, thank you, yes, ma'am. Now, I know some people may not always agree with that type of a verbal, I guess, gesture, but at the same time, there is something to be said. This is what my cousin who lives in Nashville said in preschool. This is how they're taught. And so early as that, it is instilled. And I think that's really important that in conversation, no matter, especially in today's tension of political diversity, that we need to step back and remember what we learned early on in some of that as well.
Yeah, yeah. I lived in the South for a long time, and I have relatives that still live in Tennessee, and that is true. There is this kind of genteel, everyone says yes, sir, yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Of course, just point this out, right? We know that the South has historically had problems with racism and Jim Crow and so on. So these norms of polite discourse, they're not the only thing that matters, right? And sometimes civility can be a mask and a disguise, right?
Sure.
The very, pleasant, person is really good at shaking hands and can say all the right words, but, they're still conniving and sneaky and not good. So,
Right.
you know,
Absolutely.
behind all of this needs to be a commitment to fairness and justice and respect for other people. And the polite norms of politeness should go hand in hand with all of that stuff.
Well,
You need both, really.
exactly, exactly. Well, I'm going to shift the paradigm just a little bit, and if we can pull up the bar graph here, we talked about our country's belief system and where we are. There is a bar graph that talks about where we are with Congress, and Mike, if you could pull that next one up. And it's how if we could zoom in a bit, how our country has starting to separate a little bit more from the media, from, as you would say, even if we look at the three branches of government, more specifically Congress, we really see how people view their politicians now and where we are politically. And that is our greatest, I would say, issue right now. And, depending on what side of the political platform you're talking to, again, that whole separation. And how do we start to meld that, Dr. Fiala? How do we go back, even in years gone by, philosophically? How do we bring it back together so these numbers aren't as strong with our country pulling apart?
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously an important question. It's, again, historically speaking, there were times that were worse than these times, right? I mean, we fought a civil war
Sure.
100 and some odd years ago. You know, and there may have been a kind of moment when Americans came together across the board, the post-war world, when the economy's booming and we defeated fascism in Europe. And I mean, there's this kind of good times. Maybe the good times were a blip, right? It could be that maybe we're just in normal times when people fundamentally disagree. Nonetheless, it's still dysfunctional, right? It would be
Right.
better if we could find a kind of common ground and find a way to respect one another. And I think this is part of the current situation in the United States. We need to do a better job of explaining to ourselves how we're in it together. I mean, no matter which party wins, we're still all here. No one's
Right.
leaving. We all, believe in the same system. The Constitution is fundamental for all of us, and we've gotten a little bit carried away with nitpicking the details, and we forget about the common ground that we have. Just to take this back to civility for a moment.
Sure.
When in the Congress, how when they address each other in the Senate, well, the gentleman from Georgia, et cetera, they have this kind of somewhat phony way of addressing one another, and they can still say mean things, but they do that with this genteel demeanor. Again, could be phony, but also important, right? I mean, what's going on, say, in the Senate when they talk that way, they're expressing their respect for the institution of the U.S. Senate. And behind that, they're expressing their allegiance to the norms established by the Constitution. That's the common ground. And we can't forget that. And back to ordinary life where people disagree, in our neighborhoods, everyone had a Trump sign or a Harris sign, and people were, picking sides. But we live in the same neighborhoods.
Right.
And we shop at the same grocery stores, and we drive on the same roads. And, most of the time we need to get along with one another. Even to the fact of, at the grocery store, two cars are vying for the same parking spot. Wave the other person in.
Right.
We can look at each other, and we can be kind and generous to one another, and we'll all get there, and then we're going to meet up in the store anyway.
Right.
I think we forget about that. We're so quick to sort of want to, win, or to, show that we're better than the other. But we're not. We're all in it together, and at the end of the day, we have to cooperate, because otherwise no one will be able to park. No one will be able to go to the store,
Can't imagine
we
what it
have to
would
get
look
along
like at a
with that.
place like Whole Foods, where it's always, and I always have to remind myself, there's other parking, just give grace to that person there. And that's a great way of looking at it. One of the things that when we talk about, and in your book, Tyranny from Plato to Trump, when we talk about the norms of civility, You bring that up, like certain types of rules and decorum, and you've addressed a little bit about sincerity as well. That part about that good faith as a human being, how again, how do we bring it about? How do we bring it back? What are the steps? I mean, you shared some, but what are some of the other methods? Because some people will look at each other and they look at the outer shell, and this is what I'm concerned about too. It's like, well, this is what the person looks on the outside, and they have completely no clue on how that person is on the inside. And I bring it back to reading a book. That book cover can look amazing on the outside, but it might be the worst read of your life. So how do we get past, because we do unfortunately base judgment on outer appearance or that outer shell? How can we as a society with civility and good manners get past that?
Yeah, this tendency to be quick to judge is really a character flaw, right? If you think about across the board, how quick we are to just put someone in a category and say, well, oh, you're one of those, or, now I know who you are, kind of thing. It's bad. It makes no sense. We don't know the people we're judging most of the time, and frankly, we don't bother to ask, right? No one bothers to ask, well, are you that kind of person, or tell me about yourself, because knowledge takes time, right? It's much easier to go through life with quick judgments. It's much more difficult to do the hard work of trying to get to know someone. Your neighbor with the political sign on the opposite side. It's too hard to go knock on their door and say, tell me what you believe. Our lives are too hectic in a way.
Right.
And then social media comes in on this, which encourages us to very quickly click on something and then make a judgment and move on. Which now, Hope, I'm aiming towards an antidote, which is, we would all do better if we slow down a little bit, if we, took a breath or two, if we think about what we don't know instead of asserting what we think we know. This is kind of spiritual, intellectual work that people have been talking about for thousands of years, but develop a little wisdom and a little bit of moderation and self-control. Now, how do you do that? How do you encourage that? Well, if we knew that, the world would be a perfect place. But certainly, like, that should be happening in the schools. It should be happening in churches. It should be happening in political parties, and in our families, and even in our workplaces. As you mentioned, this is a discussion of business. Where's the space in a business meeting to just pause and say, "No, are we sure, that we know everything we need to know?" Most of this stuff is so fast-paced, and people are multitasking, and people are not paying attention. So all the talk about mindfulness that people have been talking about in the last, I don't know, decade or so, all that is on the table too. And I guess the last thing I would suggest about this is, like straight up lessons. Like somebody needs to say, hey, here's how we should speak, here's how we should behave, because people are not learning those lessons at home. They're not being modeled by some of our leaders. They're not seeing it in movies and on television. Better models, better just like direct instruction on this. That might help a little bit.
So do you think, because we've moved with our generations, I mean, obviously there have been some shifts generationally. When we look at Gen Z versus millennials, and millennials versus baby boomers, and there's so many different levels of or divisions, if you will. And it's just bringing it together. I mean, I belong to an organization where we have people as old as late in their 90s and young as in their early 20s. And yet we somehow are collaborating together respectfully. And I think when you have boundaries, and that's one of the things, and you have guidelines and how people treat one another, it breeds success. And I just wanted to get your take on that as well.
Yeah, no, this intergenerational part is, I think, interesting and important. Also, different classes of people, different kinds of people.
Yes.
There's this famous book, I think it's Robert Putnam, called Bowling Alone. And the story there is that we've lost the intermediary institutions like the bowling league or the bowling team.
Yes.
People don't join these civic groups anymore. People don't go to church as much as they used to. All those kind of, Kiwanis, Rotary, all those kind of civil society groups are less and less important in people's lives. Those are places where you can meet people who are different from you. Again, maybe those clubs are not that that diverse, but nonetheless important to do so. And when there's something that happens when you're preaching to the choir all the time. You just start talking a certain way, and everyone nods along, and no one holds up a red flag and says, "Hold on a minute, maybe we shouldn't go that direction or shouldn't speak that way." So the diversity part of that's really important, I think. The public
agree.
schools, by the way, that's one of the great things. Earlier you mentioned you were going to say something about schooling. One of the great virtues of the public school system is it is a melting pot. People are, or is it a salad? I'm not sure how we describe it. People are thrown in there in all their difference, and they have
Yes.
to learn to get along. And
Yes.
those are important lessons for life.
Absolutely. And as a former teacher, and teaching from everything from gifted to special ed, from preschool all the way up through middle school, and from the wealthy of the wealthy to the poorest of the poor, it's interesting to see that, people are the same in a lot of ways. And if you say, well, Hope, did you teach any differently? No, I still taught this. I treated them all equally. And yes, I understand that you come from X background and you come from this background, but no matter where they are, they may all have problems. They could be different, but everybody's dealing with something. But what we can all agree upon is responsibility, respect, integrity, and self-worth. And those are things that I think, those values, if we could bring up the pie chart, those are things that I think are really paramount, that we can also bring about when we talk about tolerance and we talk about courage and things. So those are things that I taught in the classroom, and I know there are other colleagues out there that are doing the same. These things, I think, in everyday life we need to consider.
Yeah, for a long time, I've been involved in civic and character education work on our campus. There's an institute on campus, the Bonner Center for Character and Civic Education, that I've been on the advisory board for a long time, and visited a lot of schools across the whole Central Valley. And this character education, it's happening. The pillars, they have flags and banners and stuff. It's important to talk about values in the schools. And I'm a philosophy person, so I use the word virtue. I'm not ashamed to use the word virtue. Some people
Sure.
don't like that word. It sounds so old-fashioned, but it's an important word. And the root of the word virtue in ancient Greek is connected to the word for excellence. Virtues are things that make us excellent, and those kind of virtues of hospitality and kindness and compassion, those make us excellent human beings. All the world's traditions teach this, and we also know that the opposite of that are the not so excellent people, who are not compassionate, very quick to judge, self-interested, egoistic. So I think that language of virtue and character is important, and we shouldn't be ashamed to assert that there are virtues that are important for everyone as a human being, especially in a civilization like ours that is as diverse and fast-paced. We would do better if we would cultivate that kind of stuff. And again, just a shout out for the teachers. I know there's a
Absolutely.
lot of good teachers who are doing that every day.
Yes, and cheers to them and the parents who are reinforcing at home. As they say, it takes a village. It's a community that's working hand in hand to bring it all together. Dr. Fiala, I could talk to you forever. I truly could. I would like to thank you so much for being on the show. What I'd like to do is bring up some of the literature, and maybe you could just share with the viewers about let's start with, of course, my favorite, Hope, the trilogy. If you could tell, as we bring it up, I'll let you know which one's on the screen. If you could tell the viewers a little bit about the literature and the books that you've had a chance to write.
Yeah, so that book, Hope, is the third part of three books, Simplicity, Compassion, and Hope. And It's really nature philosophy with photography. It's my adventures in the mountains of the Sierra Nevada as a philosopher reflecting on the meaning of life, frankly. A little poetry, some photography, and a little bit of fun, too. It's supposed to be a fun series of books.
That's wonderful. Let's bring up the next one, Tyranny from Plato to Trump.
Yeah, this one sounds scary, but basically my approach there is to contextualize the Trump era in the vast scope of the history of political philosophy. And that word tyranny, by the way, has been used by everyone to describe everyone. You know, Obama was, that people claimed he was a tyrant. George W. Bush was a tyrant. Biden was a tyrant. Trump. What my goal there is to get people to be more careful in thinking about all of this stuff, with the hopeful conclusion that the U.S. Constitution is set up to prevent tyranny. My reading of the constitutional system and the history of that is that the biggest problem is tyranny, and our system is designed to prevent tyranny. So even if someone wants to claim that Obama or Trump or whoever is a tyrant, it's kind of impossible in our system for a tyrant to actually gain power.
Thank you for clarifying that title. So at least that opens up to readers so they have a better understanding too. What about civility, religious pluralism, and education?
Yeah, that was a project I had with a colleague, a grant-funded project where we worked with diverse religious people across the country, really, with a focus in Central California, because we have a very robust interfaith community here.
Yes.
And you know about the diversity of our region. And so we put together a 2-year project, and we hosted a bunch of religious leaders, a bunch of scholars. And the thrust of that project was, in this diverse religious world in which we live, we have to find a way to get along. And we know the history of religion has not worked out that way usually. Right? There's a lot of crusading idealism, to use a religious term, in the history of religion. There's religious violence and persecution and so on. The great thing about the American system is we have the First Amendment, which guarantees the right to freedom of religious expression and prevents the government from establishing a religion. That's the framework. And in that framework, then, we could all do a better job of listening to each other and learning from each other, and not trying to impose our beliefs on others. So that's really the focus of that book.
Well, you have just brought a wealth of knowledge here on this interview today, and I thank you so much, Dr. Fiala, for joining us. If people want to reach out to you, they can at www.andrewfiala.com. Once again, www.andrewfiala.com. I thank you so much, Dr. Fiala, for being a part of the show today. I really appreciate it, and I think you brought some excellent insight today.
Great. Thanks for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
Oh, I'm so glad you did. This is Hope Rosky with Business, Arts, and Events.